Okay, so we're coming to the end of this series. This is the last episode, and we have only gotten 12 minutes so far. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes of your time, but it'll be one of the five most informative minutes of your life. You'll be shocked. Okay, I mean, there's so many different things that shocked me, but this shocked me and surprised me. Things I did not know. The heading of this article is Paul taught a Pharisee doctrine to condemn Gentiles who tried to follow Torah. Now, I didn't know the Orthodox, which are the heirs to the Pharisees, actually today still teach, and I'm going to show you there's an article where you can read this Orthodox paper, and I'm going to summarize it here as we go, that you cannot, as a Gentile, read Torah. And in fact, it's still even a death penalty in the Torah, not in the law of God, but in the Hakalah, meaning the Pharisee doctrines that are the part of Orthodox teaching today, to have a Gentile read indiscriminately passages that are only intended for Israelites. So I was like, wow, this is serious stuff. So the Orthodox of today are these people who take this view about Gentiles reading the law. And if you study the way Paul's talking to the Galatians and in other places in his epistles, you'll see he's actually talking very much like it's dangerous. And so it's hard to understand, and I call it evil because he's saying to the Gentiles, if you want to obey Sabbath in Galatians 3, if you want to obey Sabbath, you're cursed that you have to obey all of these commands, and so you can never do that. Therefore, you're just going down the wrong way. You have to go down the path that doesn't require you reading any of this stuff. And then he also says in Romans that the reading of the letter kills, and then he says in Romans 7 that reading the law leads to sin, because it arouses your desires. And part of me, it's so crazy but was Paul, did he have a special doctrine that when he's talking to Gentiles, he can talk like this? Because this is how the Pharisees did it. They divided it up. If they were talking to a crowd of Israelites, they would say the exact opposite. But if they're talking to a crowd of Gentiles, they would say, you're going to kill yourself by reading these things. So we see a divided mind in Paul, but this Pharisee doctrine explains a lot about Paul. So I think you're going to get an insight into Paul's way. It sounds crazy when you see what Paul's teaching, and not that it's less crazy knowing why he's contradictory, but this is why he's contradictory, because the Pharisees at their heart are in this contradiction where men and women who are Gentiles are not allowed to read the law, and if they do, they're doing something deadly and going to kill themselves. But if they're Jews, they can read the same thing and it brings them life. So this is crazy, but it's true. Wait till you see. All right, so let's read. You know what? I'm going to pause, and then I'll come right back. All right, so let's read. Let's read. Paul terrorizes Galatians who follow the law. In Galatians, Paul bemoans Galatian Christians who wish to keep Sabbath as provided in the Ten Commandments, a command specifically applicable to all Gentiles in community with Israel. This is in Deuteronomy 5, verses 12 to 15. Sojourner within thy gates must obey Sabbath. Right? Leviticus 25, verse 6. Sojourner settling with thee must obey Sabbath. Exodus 23. Sojourner must obey Sabbath. Paul then says, anathema, or cursed, are those who wish to be just or justified by keeping such parts of the law, specifically Sabbath and also new moons and other holiday day cycles that the law says to do. For otherwise, Paul argues that they will have to keep all of the law and not selected parts. Galatians 1, verses 6 to 12, Galatians 2 to 14, and verses 14 and 16. And he says, cursed if you do not continue in all points of the law. Galatians 3, verses 9 through 12, you're under a curse. Misquoting Deuteronomy, as explained at this link, so I have an article that he's wrong. It's not a curse. Galatians 3, verse 21. Paul thereby misrepresented the law was an all or nothing thing for a Gentile. Rather than tell the Gentiles they were a discrete category called sojourners in the law, which had very few provisions they had to abide by. See the law applicable to Gentiles. And I emphasize this to you because this is why the Gentiles don't have the burden that they are told to have. But if you read this, you would think, if I try to obey anything, I'm going to damn myself because I'd have to do all these things. And Paul says I'm cursed. So this is frightening stuff. Where did this come from? It's very strange. And just to show you something, I'm not the only one who sees this as odd. Bart Ehrman, who used to be a Christian, that's how people tell me to refer to Bart, but he's a very, I'd say he's sensitive to Christians. He was a Christian. But one thing he is, you can't deny, is he's read the text and he understands all the textual problems and all that. But I wish he were a believer, but, miracles can happen. Hopefully one day he'll see the light about that. But anyway, he's a good guy. A professor on the New Testament, he explains, Paul is absolutely clear in Galatians that he thinks non-Jews are not to do these things, that is, keep Sabbath holidays, once they believe in Christ. In fact, in his most vitriolic letter, he's talking about Galatians, the one to the Galatians, he lays a curse on anyone who thinks that Galatians who come to believe in Jesus should engage in such practices. 1, verses 8 to 9, 2, verses 15 to 16, chapter 3, 10 to 14, Bart Ehrman in his book, Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene, 2006 at 117. Okay. Hence, Paul curses those Gentile Christians who obey Sabbath for a biblically valid reason. And what is that reason? Exodus 20, verse 6. In the Ten Commandments, it has this statement between the first and the second commandment. God says, I extend mercy. And by the way, that's synonymous with the word charis, or grace. I extend grace to those who love and obey commandments of Yahweh. Okay? Now, let me just also finish up with Paul a little bit here. Paul extends the same curse implicitly to Jews by saying that anyone who believes one is justified by God, before God, by keeping the law is actually lost if they did so. Just the belief alone that you could be justified by God by obeying laws like the Sabbath and circumcision. Okay, Galatians 2, verses 15 to 16, he says, no one is justified by keeping the law. Now, thus, implicitly, Paul is saying Moses himself was a false prophet. This is very clear. Listen to what the verse says. Deuteronomy 6, verses 24 to 25. Moses said, Yahweh commanded us to observe all these statutes. Then it will be righteousness, that is, justification, for us if we are careful to observe all these commandments. Okay? So if like what is it, Habakkuk 2, verse 4, when Paul's reading that verse where it says, the righteous shall live by pistis, in the Septuagint Greek translation of that passage, he'll say that means that basically the just or the justified shall live by faith. So in other words, they're justified by faith. So you can't say that this concept in Hebrew about righteousness didn't have this same concept in Deuteronomy 6, 24, 25. So Paul is saying that Moses is wrong, that keeping the law won't do you any good. And what do we show you here in Exodus 26? God says it does. Exodus 20, verse 6, between the first and second commandment, God says, mercy to those who love and obey commandments of Yahweh. Okay, so I got to stop here. I think we're running tight on time. Let me just see if there's anything I really need to tell you. Yeah, I have to show you something real quick, and then we'll try to get to the very important ending here. Okay, so before we get in, I want to show you the commandments, the Orthodox view about not reading the law. So I showed you that Paul says you're cursed if you're a Gentile and you read the law, and I show you the Orthodox still teach this today, okay? So it's not just Paul. Why does it line up with the Orthodox? And that's what's so odd here. But just for the point that you understand, when Paul tells the Galatians that they'll be cursed by obeying Sabbath, which is simply just resting on Saturday, ladies and gentlemen, this violates the actual promise of God's salvation to Gentiles. It's in Isaiah 56:1. My salvation is about to come, and he's talking about the Messiah is going to come. And Jesus teaches the Sabbath. He just teaches you can do good on the Sabbath, but he never takes and abrogates it. So God in Isaiah 56 predicates salvation on two things: keep the Sabbath from profaning it, and keep his hand from doing evil. Isaiah 56, verse 2. And then he's going to say in Isaiah 54, verses 4 to 6, he's going to save the Gentiles who, quote, keep my Sabbaths and choose things that please me and take hold of my covenant. So Paul is actually taking away the path of salvation to Gentiles. Okay? It's just as clear as day. So he's completely contradicting God's word, Yahweh's word, on how Gentiles are to be saved. So I suggest to anybody who's going to church on Sunday, there's nothing wrong going to church on Sunday, but take off Saturday and don't work at your normal job. Is that so hard? and then honor that day and take time for God and go into prayer and treat it as a sacred day. Okay? All right. So anyway, I want to show you something that's going on here. All right. Now we're going to, let me show you this. Okay. Now we're getting back to this Orthodox view. We're going to see that it's currently still taught by the Pharisaic branch of Judaism, which is the Orthodox. Paul says to the Galatian Christians, this is about circumcision, about those who obey God's commandments as Christians to stay in God's grace. You have severed yourself from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law. You have fallen from grace. So nothing could be clearer that you are going to hell by trying to obey God's law, literally. Okay? Sounds crazy until you read this Orthodox article I read. That's why I'm trying to lead you up to it very clearly. And then you'll see that Paul is contradicting, and so will the Orthodox. They're contradicting Exodus 20, verse 6, which God says, I extend mercy to those who love me and obey my commandments, right? That's between the first and second commandments. Memorize that. Go to Exodus 20. This is the gospel of grace that God gave to the people of Israel. I'll give mercy to those who love me and obey my commandments. Thus, Paul teaches you are saved by faith alone, but become damned by obeying one of God's commands in the Ten Commandments if motivated to satisfy the requirement in Exodus 20, verse 6, part of the Ten Commandments as well. Paul is talking about the Sabbath command in context, a command that was specifically extended in the law and the prophets to Gentiles and foreigners who dwelled among the sons of Israel. And again, on this parallel topic of circumcision, which the law necessitated a Gentile to have done only if they wished to enter the temple at Jerusalem, pursuant to Ezekiel 44, verse 9, or they wished to participate in Passover, per Exodus 12, verse 49. But Paul says in the same context, if you try to be circumcised, what's word? He says, mark my words. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Or as the KJV renders it, Christ will profit you nothing, Galatians 5:2. Yet he circumcised Timothy. It's right in the book of Acts. He sent his friend to hell by making him get circumcised, and he did the circumcision personally. It's kind of gross, right? All right, so people are losing their salvation left and right around Paul. Either they're being led away from Sabbath, or he's circumcising his friend Timothy, causing him to go to hell because he said he's severed from Christ by doing something that the Bible requires. So here's what I want to get to, and we're going to talk about the Pharisee doctrine on the Torah for Gentiles. This is very important, and so now we're going to stop. I think I've given you a real lesson on Paul being very anti-Torah and cursing people for doing the very thing that God required of the Gentiles. It's a very shameful thing that he did, and he led many millions of Christians away from being saved. That's all you can say. And it's going on still to this day because Christians have been leading lives that ignore the Sabbath, and they can't claim they don't know the command. We've all read the Ten Commandments. We all see the Sabbath day you keep holy, but we don't do it because we've been told by Paul we don't have to, and we're cursed if we tried. If we try to do it to please God, we're cursed. Okay, so now we're going to study the Pharisee doctrine on Torah for Gentiles. And I'm just going to give you a quick idea here. As I point out in Matthew 23:23, Jesus said the Pharisees neglected and did not teach the law on its judgments, right and wrong, mercy, Exodus 26, right? The mercy for obedience of loving Yahweh, and pistis, which, by the way, can mean obedience or faithfulness or faith. So that's what Jesus is saying. So I'm going to suggest to you that it's possible Jesus was talking about the very doctrine I'm going to show you today. It's a possibility. So Paul says, as a Jew, he learned strict obedience as a Pharisee, right? Acts 26, verse 5. I conform to the strictest sect of the Pharisees. Let's assume that's true. But let's imagine, is it possible it was only strict for Jews, but extremely loose and completely different for a Gentile? What if that was the case? Just like Paul's view of the Gentiles. Keep them away from the Torah. Don't make them read it. It's Paul's view, right? The Pharisees were virtually at the same point as Paul is, and that's what's scary about this. And so we could go through Jesus' teachings. So what did the Gentiles teach? Okay. So let's take a look here. So first, I found it in the Orthodox writings, and so I said, let's take a look at the Mishnah. And so the old days. The Mishnah portion of Talmud was written in the early 200s. It codifies teachings of Judaism. Second with the Mishnah is the Sanhedrin tractate, records of a judicial body that operated during the Roman era. Then we find out the Mishnah Talmud was written, the Pharisees was the only institution of Judaism from the time of Christ, which survived the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, I'm getting that. The Mishnah Talmud embodies passages quoting known Pharisaic teachers from Jesus' era. So it's generally understood that the controlling group from the 200s forward were the Orthodox. So the Pharisees were the only party left. Well, what do they teach? The Pharisees generally barred Gentiles studying Torah in line with Orthodox doctrine. So that's Pharisee. Avram Ben Yaakov has a topic entitled Should Gentiles Study the Torah in his article in the journal Mitzvah at this link. And now I have it up on my screen, and I'm going to go there real quick to show you. It's still there. You can still find this article. So if you want, write this down. Should Gentiles study the Torah? And Yaakov, Yaakov. I want to include the entire context so we can gain a feel for what Pharisaic Judaism allowed to be taught way back when. All the way back at Paul's time. Here are the 5 points at this link. They reflect the position that the Talmud Mishnah, including the Sanhedrin tractate, told Gentiles they would be executed or killed if they should study Torah. Thus, Gentiles studied risk of death if they studied Torah. The only exception was if they convert, a code word for those who became circumcised. Sound familiar? This exception likewise fits that certain men in Acts 15 verses 1 to 2 insisted Gentiles must be circumcised to be saved. No doubt these were Pharisees. However, they lost that point in the Jerusalem conference under Bishop James. With that introduction, here are Yaakov's 5 points verbatim. I'm going to pause here because the screen is actually a little bit knocked off there. I want you to be able to see the whole thing. Hold on. Okay, so this is his article. I think this is his article. The Torah was specifically given to the children of Israel to guard and observe, and many of its commandments apply only to those who are members of the people of Israel. Yes, this is him writing. Whether by birth or through voluntary lawful conversion. At the same time, the Torah is full of teachings that apply to all mankind, especially the 7 universal laws, and it is a treasury of eternal wisdom, guidance, love, and compassion for all. 1. Hold on, I gotta make this go. Okay. 1. Every Gentile is obligated to learn and understand the 7 universal laws, which apply to all people. Under Noahide law, a Gentile may be executed for unintentionally violating one of the 7 laws through ignorance because he should have learned. And this is in the Talmud, Makot 9, Bava Kama. These all mean something to him. I don't know what they are, but they're obviously authoritative sources. So the Gentile took a risk getting involved in this religion. You make a mistake even out of ignorance, you could be killed. It seems a little extreme, I would guess, but what do I know? 2, every Gentile is commanded to know Hashem, that means the Lord, or the name actually, introduction to Talmud, so on and so forth. So that means the Gentile must know the name of God, namely Yahweh. 3, this is where it gets interesting. Sounds like Paul. It is forbidden for a Gentile to study those portions of the Torah that apply only to the people of Israel as members of the covenant, obligated to observe all 613 commandments of the Torah specifically given to Israel. According to Talmud, a Gentile who studies those portions will be liable to death from heaven, cites the Sanhedrin 59a. This would apply to an in-depth study of the Talmud and Kabbalah, for the proper understanding of which years of preparation are required. Without these, such study can be dangerous for the student and possibly for many others around him or her. Any Gentile who sincerely wishes to make a deep study of Talmud or the original Kabbalistic text should first convert. So you are taking a big danger. If you're a Gentile and you haven't converted, which means circumcision, you should not read anything. You could go to hell. Now, let's just say you're Paul and you have a similar block going on. It now makes more sense what Paul's teaching, that he doesn't want his people to be circumcised. You know they're not going to want to do that. So he doesn't want them to convert. And if they don't convert, they can't read anything of the law. They really can't read anything of the law. They could read the Noahide laws, but that's really nothing. I mean, it's, you can't eat meat. I don't think the Noahide laws are anywhere. It's like when Noah gets off the ark. Is there some commandments that are listed and what they are? I think there's 6 or 7, but they're very loose things about eating food, and there's not much there. I mean, there's no there. There's no 10 commandments there. That's for sure. But let's continue here. It is permitted for a Gentile to study those of the 613 commandments for Israelites that a Gentile may observe voluntarily without converting. Later commentaries in this series will set forth what these commandments are, but we already saw what they were. You don't need, converting is what? Circumcision. You can enter the temple in the old days. So now they might have a similar rule for their synagogues. You can't go in the synagogue maybe unless you're converted until you're circumcised, or you can't celebrate Passover for sure unless you're converted, unless you have circumcised yourself. So this sounds a lot like Paul again, where you basically restrict the Gentile from participating in Jewish life, keep them away from that, and then you don't run this risk that they're going to be subject to a death penalty from heaven. So maybe Paul was keeping all this to himself and just telling people the most scary things possible to keep them away from the law, because by studying these things, he was afraid they would suffer death from heaven. That's what the Sanhedrin tractate 98 or 58 said, 58a, right? So he's worried about them, but he doesn't want to share that with them. And actually, the command to observe Sabbath was a commandment on Gentiles in the community, so Paul shouldn't have frightened them about Sabbath. That's really a big blunder on his part, because that's part of salvation, right? In Isaiah 56. Gentile, what do they have to do? Keep the Sabbath and avoid evil. We really didn't even reference what that meant. But the one thing that was specific and highlighted was the Sabbath, and that's the one thing Paul is telling them not to do, and you're cursed if you do it. But let's keep going. I want to wrap it up for you so you can get the picture. Other Torah and works that Gentiles may study with benefit and without danger would include the Bible and works on the fundamentals of Torah faith, belief, and ethical self-improvement by acknowledged rabbinical authorities, including Rabbi Moses, Maimonides, and so on. And this is strange. How can I study the Bible? I guess what it is you're going to tell me what passages I can't read and can read. Okay, but Paul didn't have that kind of ability to print out some mimeographs and tell people what not to read and read, so he basically just banned it and said, don't even read it. So there's something in common between Paul and the Orthodox of today, these strange commands. And so I say, I did a comparison of all of it. So basically, to me, there's a lot in common between Paul. Okay, I'm just going to tell you that that's the point. You can read the whole article and you can make a decision. Now I just want to show you the article real quick so you can see it yourself. Okay, so I want to show you this article. It's in the journal Mitzvah, and actually looks like they speak Spanish here too. Estudos Diarios de Torah Kabbalah, Journal Mitzvah, Torah for the Nations, comment on the weekly portion, Avram Ben Yaakov, Torah Study and the Dignity of Man, and you'll find everything I told you is here. Should the Gentiles study the Torah? And he'll talk about the death penalty, liable to death from heaven. Do you see that? There it is. That's what struck me. Paul is doing the same thing. Like, they're going to be killed if they do this. So it's not that strange a doctrine, actually. It's just strange how Paul interpreted it and applied it to be just, you know what? I'm not going to get into detail with them. I'm just going to tell them you're cursed if you follow all these things. But the mistake he really made was telling them not to observe Sabbath. That's a big, big blunder. And fatal spiritually. Think about it. If that's what God said, how, but he blocked them. He said, don't even read this stuff. Don't read the law. So I wonder what God's going to do. God is fair and just. I hope and pray that God will forgive people who were misled by Paul. But you know what? I don't know. So you can't be sure. So you just have to teach people the truth is Jesus didn't get rid of the Sabbath. He taught us that we could do good on Sabbath, but he didn't get rid of it. Wouldn't make sense to teach us you can do good on the Sabbath if his intention is to abolish it. So anyway, I hope this helps everybody. We see that Paul gave a teaching on women being silent in the church is based on a law that wasn't in the law. It was a Hakalah. We can see that Paul follows the Hakalah, meaning the Pharisees' doctrines. When it comes to the Gentiles, he's exactly teaching similar to them. He went more extreme, but similar to them, that the Gentiles should not read and study the law with very limited exceptions and could only do so if they were converted. Paul didn't want to put them through conversion, and so he created this whole thing where just let's ignore the law and you're better off. You can see a death penalty. The Sanhedrin tractate means this was the court that was in operation at the time of Jesus, said something along these lines, that Gentiles would be subject to a death penalty from heaven, meaning we're not going to execute them, but they would be subject to a death penalty from heaven if they read and study the law without our control and administration. Okay, so I hope that helps us really get a better understanding of what's going on with Paul. He is definitely trying to be a conveyor of of a very strange Pharisaical doctrine. What did Jesus say? The Pharisees of what? Make you twice the sons of hell than before you met him. And that's exactly what Paul does. He makes you twice the son of hell by these teachings. Okay, God bless everybody. Take care.